The holographic display flickered to life in the center of the observation chamber. Ambassador Vexter of the Carillion Empire stood motionless, his four eyes fixed on the images that materialized before him. Around him, a dozen other alien diplomats from various worlds had gathered for what the humans called a history lesson. They had requested it themselves, eager to understand the strange species that had somehow survived long enough to reach the stars. The human historian, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, stood beside the display with her arms crossed. She was a small woman by human standards, barely reaching the chest height of most aliens in the room. Yet she commanded attention in a way that made Vexter uncomfortable. There was something in her eyes, a fire that burned quietly but never went out. "You asked why humans are the way we are," Sarah began, her voice steady and calm. "You wanted to know how a species from a death world managed to build an interstellar civilization in such a short time. The answer is simple. We learned to survive by watching each other die." The hologram shifted, revealing an ancient city of stone and marble. Vexter recognized it from the human historical archives. Rome, they called it. One of their earliest great civilizations. The city sprawled across 7 hills, and above it all, massive stone structures carried water across impossible distances. "The aqueducts," Sarah continued, gesturing toward the towering arches. "These were built over 2,000 years before humans reached space. They carried fresh water into the city, feeding fountains, public baths, and private homes. At its peak, Rome delivered over 1 million cubic meters of water every single day. The engineering was so advanced that some of these structures still stand today." Kreth, an insectoid diplomat from the Hive worlds, clicked his mandibles in confusion. "Your species achieved such engineering before you even discovered electricity? How is that possible?" Sarah smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Necessity, desperation, the refusal to accept death quietly. That is what drives humans. The hologram shifted again. This time, it showed the same city, but something was wrong. The ground was shaking. Buildings swayed and cracked. People ran through the streets, their faces twisted in terror. The great aqueduct that dominated the skyline began to groan. Stone ground against stone. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ancient structure. "The earthquake struck without warning," Sarah narrated. "The ground itself betrayed the people of Rome, and then the aqueduct collapsed. The aliens watched in silence as the massive structure crumbled. Thousands of tons of stone fell into the city below, crushing homes and temples alike. But that was not the worst of it. The water that the aqueduct carried did not stop flowing. It poured from the broken structure like blood from a wound, flooding the lower districts of the city within minutes." Vexter felt his stomach turn as the hologram showed humans being swept away by the rushing water. Children clung to their mothers. Old men were pulled under by the current. Bodies floated through streets that had been full of life just moments before. The death toll climbed higher and higher as the water continued to pour. "Thousands died in the initial flooding," Sarah said quietly. "The records estimate anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 people lost their lives that day. Entire families were wiped out. Generations ended in an instant." The Carillion ambassador finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is horrifying. Why would you show us this? What lesson can be learned from such tragedy?" Sarah turned to face him directly. Her eyes bore into his with an intensity that made him step back. "Watch what happens next." The hologram continued. The water eventually stopped flowing as the source was cut off upstream. The survivors emerged from wherever they had found shelter. They were covered in mud and blood. Many of them had lost everything. Family members, homes, their entire lives destroyed in a matter of hours. But they did not give up. The hologram showed the survivors gathering in the ruins. They did not wait for help. They did not sit and cry for what was lost. Within hours of the disaster, they had already begun to organize. Teams were formed to search for survivors trapped in the rubble. Others worked to redirect the remaining water away from populated areas. Physicians set up makeshift hospitals and temple courtyards, treating the wounded with whatever supplies they could find. The Roman spirit, Sarah explained, was not something that could be drowned. These people had just watched their city be destroyed. They had lost friends, family, and neighbors. Yet instead of surrendering to despair, they chose to fight. Not against an enemy they could see, but against fate itself. The hologram jumped forward in time. Days had passed. The dead had been buried with proper honors. The wounded were being cared for. And already, workers were clearing the debris from the collapsed aqueduct. Engineers surveyed the damage, making plans for reconstruction. Within 1 week of the disaster, construction had begun on a new aqueduct, Sarah continued. Not a repair of the old one. A completely new structure, designed to be stronger and more resistant to earthquakes. The Romans did not simply rebuild what was lost. They improved upon it. Kreth leaned forward, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic light. They started building again so quickly? After losing so many of their people? Why would they not flee the safer territory? Because running away is not in human nature, Sarah replied. We do not abandon our homes because of danger. We do not surrender to forces that seek to destroy us. We adapt. We overcome. We build back stronger. The hologram showed the months that followed. Workers labored day and night, laying new foundations and raising new arches. The project employed thousands of people, many of whom had lost everything in the flood. Instead of becoming refugees, they became builders. Their grief was channeled into creation. Their anger at the cruel twist of fate became fuel for their determination. What you must understand, Sarah said, addressing all the aliens in the room, is that this is not an isolated incident. This is the pattern of human history. Every disaster, every tragedy, every moment of destruction has been met with the same response. We mourn our dead, and then we get back to work. She waved her hand, and the hologram began cycling through other moments in human history. Cities burned by war, then rebuilt larger than before. Plagues that killed millions, followed by medical breakthroughs that saved billions. Natural disasters that leveled entire regions, followed by reconstruction efforts that brought communities closer together. The earthquake that destroyed the aqueduct was not the first disaster Rome had faced, Sarah continued. And it was not the last. The city was sacked by invaders multiple times. It burned. It fell into decay. It was rebuilt again and again over thousands of years. Today, Rome still stands. Not as a ruin of the past, but as a living city, a testament to human stubbornness. Vexter found his voice again. But the suffering, the loss of life, how do your people bear such pain repeatedly? Sarah paused before answering. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. We bear it because we have no other choice. Death is not optional for humans. Neither is suffering. These are constants in our existence. What we do have control over is how we respond. Every generation that comes after a disaster inherits not just the trauma of the past, but also the knowledge of how their ancestors survived it. The hologram now showed the completed aqueduct. It was larger than the original, with reinforced arches and improved water distribution systems. The people of Rome gathered to celebrate its opening. Children played in the fountains fed by the new structure. Life had returned to the city. The survivors of the flood did not live to see the new aqueduct completed, Sarah admitted. Many of those who worked on it died before it was finished, but they worked anyway. They laid stones they would never see carry water. They built for the future, not for themselves. A Thraxian diplomat with pale blue skin raised one of his 3 hands. This concept is difficult for us. On our world, when disaster strikes, the affected population relocates. We do not rebuild in places that have proven dangerous. It seems illogical. Sarah nodded slowly. By pure logic, you might be right. But humans are not purely logical creatures. We form attachments to places, to communities, to ideas. We do not abandon these things easily. The people of Rome could have fled to safer ground after the earthquake. But Rome was not just a location to them. It was home. It was identity. It was everything their ancestors had built and died for. Abandoning it would have been a betrayal of everyone who came before. She gestured toward the hologram one final time. The image shifted to show Earth from orbit. The blue planet hung in the void of space, beautiful and fragile. When humans finally reached the stars, many other species expected us to leave our homeworld behind. After all, Earth is dangerous by galactic standards. Earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, ice ages. The list of disasters our planet has thrown at us is endless. Yet even now, with colonies on dozens of worlds, Earth remains the heart of human civilization. Over 10 billion people still call it home. Vexter slowly shook his head in disbelief. You stay on a world that actively tries to kill you? Why? Sarah smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. Because it made us who we are. Every disaster we survived shaped us. Every tragedy we overcame taught us. The floods, the earthquakes, the famines, and the plagues. They were terrible. They cost us countless lives. But they also forged us into a species that refuses to quit. A species that looks at impossible odds and says, we can survive this. A species that builds aqueducts after they collapse, and cities after they burn, and civilizations after they fall. She walked to the center of the room, standing directly beneath the holographic image of Earth. The alien diplomats watched her in silence, their earlier skepticism replaced by something closer to understanding. You wanted to know how humans reached the stars, Sarah concluded. The answer is that we clawed our way here. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood and tears. Every victory was built on the graves of those who came before. We are not a species blessed with natural advantages. We do not have armor like the Carillions, or collective intelligence like the Hive worlds, or the long lifespans of the Thraxians. What we have is the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The hologram faded away, leaving the room in soft lighting. The diplomats exchanged glances, processing what they had just witnessed. Vexter stepped forward, his 4 eyes meeting Sarah's too. The aqueduct collapse, the thousands who died. You speak of it not with shame, but with a strange kind of pride. I do not fully understand this. Sarah reached out and placed her hand on the Carillion's arm. The gesture surprised him. Physical contact between species was rare in diplomatic settings. We are not proud of the deaths, she said gently. We mourn them still, even after all these centuries. But we are proud of what came after. The survivors who refused to give up. The workers who rebuilt what was lost. The children who grew up in a city that their parents had saved from destruction. That is what we celebrate. Not the tragedy, but the triumph over it. The session ended shortly after. The alien diplomats filed out of the observation chamber, each lost in their own thoughts. They had come seeking knowledge about humanity. What they had found was something far more profound. A species that had learned to turn suffering into strength and tragedy into triumph. Vexter remained behind after the others had left. He stared at the space where the hologram had been, replaying the images in his mind. The collapsing aqueduct, the rushing water, the bodies of the dead. And then, against all logic, the survivors rising from the mud to begin rebuilding. He finally understood why the other galactic powers had warned him about humans. It was not their technology or their military that made them dangerous. It was something far more fundamental. They were a species that simply did not know when to quit. A species that looked at death and disaster and decided to keep going anyway. For the first time in his long diplomatic career, Vexter felt something he had never experienced before when dealing with another species. It was not fear, exactly. It was closer to respect. The kind of respect one feels for a force of nature. Unpredictable, sometimes destructive, but ultimately unstoppable. The humans had earned their place among the stars, not through luck or circumstance, but through thousands of years of refusing to surrender. And that, Vexter realized, was why they would be around long after other species had faded from the galaxy. They did not know how to die.